Do you love deep dives into history, politics, and the kind of behind-the-scenes power moves that really shaped the modern world, especially the great city of New York? If so, then today's book just might be for you. Today, I'll be reviewing The Power Broker by Robert Caro. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and today we're talking about one of the longest, most detailed, and frankly, most rewarding books that I think I have ever read. It is over 1,200 pages long. It is very detailed at particular moments. It is telling the story of one individual, Robert Moses, who held a variety of positions in New York City, but most notably was responsible for building up much of the infrastructure, as well as a lot of the parks and just a lot of the very visible elements of the city of New York in the early to middle of the 20th century. And as you can tell by the full title of the book, The Power Broker, Robert Moses and the Fall of New York, you can tell it does not quite have a happy ending. This massive biography of Robert Moses tells the story of a man who wielded almost unimaginable power over New York City, like I said, in its infrastructure throughout the 20th century. And this book is not just famous for its length, clocking in at over 1,200 pages, but by the way that Caro meticulously uncovers Moses' rise to power and the consequences of his decisions for New York, not just for himself, although he definitely had a soft spot for other socialites like himself, but for everyone, particularly the poor and the marginalized, and how he himself contributed to making, in many cases, the poor and the marginalized even poorer and even more marginalized, especially in his attitudes towards infrastructure, most notably his insistence on building streets instead of letting there be major investment in the mass transit. He himself was a big fan of building more and bigger streets, trying to make New York a car city. And if anyone has ever been to New York, then you know that that is just an absurdity, and yet there are still very much the consequences of that being played out in New York to this day. I will admit that this book is a commitment. Like I said, it is long. It is, I'll say it's dense, but man, I enjoyed reading it. No chapter did I say, man, this is really boring. Even the chapters where it's a little more tangential and Robert Caro is trying to give you a good deal of detail around maybe a practice or around what were the different organizations that were involved in different decisions. There are definitely those moments in there that are in that, but it's also still just riveting. I decided to actually read this book because the podcast 99% Invisible, they also read it, and every month they had a rather extended episode that talked about roughly about a 1/12 of the book each time, and I think each episode was like 2.5 to 3 hours, and they went into pretty pretty minute detail in some cases, but I found the podcast also very interesting. So I highly recommend that if this is going to be an appealing book to you and you were not already aware of this connection, you should not only read this book, you should also listen to the podcast. You'll get a lot of great details. I think the hosts of the podcast do a great job, not just of covering the book, but they're funny. They also do a great job of bringing in other people to interview. They actually interviewed Robert at least twice for their podcast, but then they also got really important individuals from New York, such as AOC. They even had an interview with Conan O'Brien because he also considers this a foundational book for his understanding of the city of New York. And so you can, a lot of people that as soon as they are shown how much of the current face of New York is based off of decisions made by Robert Moses, they suddenly can appreciate this incredibly long and detailed book. I will say this book, it's not just long. Caro really changed much about research for an individual. I mean, not to say that people hadn't written, equally long books or biographies about other people before this, but just his approach, I really think this was pretty revolutionary. And he himself, if you're not familiar with Robert Caro, this is his first major work, his first major book, and he has since also written a very detailed history of Lyndon B. Johnson. I have reviewed the first book in that series. I hope to read the other 4 that are out, and there will be a 5th one coming. So this is also, each of those is quite lengthy, although I don't think any of them are quite as long as this single volume. But I will say that similar to what you see in the LBJ books is, Robert Caro just has this ability to reveal the backroom deals and just the manipulation of laws and the sheer force of will that allowed Moses to reshape New York City. He also delves into the human cost. I mean, he particularly talks about the displaced communities, or communities that weren't necessarily displaced, but communities that got cut off by roads that got built instead of mass transit being built there. And so these are the types of things that you can see being detailed, not just the individual events that lead up to it, but then trying to account for people that have felt the brunt of this and actually experienced it and could tell you. I will say that's one of the hallmarks of this book. It was written while Robert Moses was still alive, and many of the people that had experienced the consequences of his city planning could also attest to what exactly it was like. And the fascinating thing is that the early years of Robert Moses led him to be a beloved individual throughout New York. And there apparently was, a lot of infrastructure, but also a lot of parks and all sorts of things that went up that just made people like him, but without an understanding of how much backhanded and how much at times straight up illegal, if not at the very least in legal gray areas, Robert Moses really had to deal with to get what he wanted done. And like I said, it was almost always entirely based off of his own personal interests, and basically never did he try to consider a much larger purpose in terms of benefiting the lower classes and especially people of color. There's quite a few points where the book discusses deliberate decisions he made in terms of not just where things went in New York in terms of parks and other services and pools and stuff like that, but then things that they would do, like keep pools a certain temperature, because he believed that that would prevent African Americans from coming and using the pool if it was a little too cold. So not only using racial stereotyping, but also using this justification, trying to prevent people of color from coming to use this service that was, built by this city, and so it should have been accessible to the city's residents. But you can certainly see a rather malicious element in the way he thought about things. There's a lot that details the fact that, I mean, Robert Moses, even though he came from money, the jobs that he took frequently did not actually pay that much money, yet he still seemed to have ways of having access to lots of different office space. He had a driver that drove him everywhere. I'm not entirely sure how, considering he actually did not really make all that much money, at least at the beginning of his career. He would have access to all sorts of restaurants and really high-end things that your average person would either have to pay big bucks to get into or have some kind of really important connections. Robert Moses would have those connections, and he definitely utilized them. And so I would say overall, if you haven't gotten this by this review at this point, but Robert Caro is not just trying to show you the deliberate decisions that Robert Moses made that have affected the landscape of New York City, and particularly its livability and its social upward mobility based off of just the way the city has been built. You can also see that there was a very clear element of elitism in Robert Moses and his attitude towards the rest of society. And you can see how that has really dramatic impact. And this is, of course, an individual whose career essentially ended 60 years ago, and yet it's really hard to downplay just how important the decisions he made are still affecting New York to this day. And there's still jokes about certain subway trains that have supposedly been in the works for decades now at this point. And you can see how some of that goes back to Robert Moses and the choices that he made. So who is this book for? Well, it's not going to be for a fan of Robert Moses, that's for sure, which I don't think he has many these days. I think that this book details, even though he was incredibly popular, at one point, like I said, the title of it suggests the fall of Robert Moses as well as the city of New York. It details not just the reasons why you are going to see a decline in the quality of life in New York based off of Robert Moses' decisions, but it is also going to show you how he himself becomes increasingly unpopular because the public is becoming more and more aware of the types of things that he was doing to insist on building the infrastructure that he wanted, whether it was actually justifiable or made any sense. Also, the amount of people that were displaced from some of the things that he did, that was making its way increasingly into the news in a way that it hadn't always before. And so by the end of his career, he is actually going to be notably less popular than he had been at the beginning. So it becomes a bit of a tragic downfall for this individual who had really worked hard to build the city. It's just that he was adamant about doing it his way, and it had very long-term consequences. So the book is for individuals that are ready to read not just a whole lot about one individual, but to read a whole lot about one city. Granted, one of the most important cities in the world, and it is going to be for individuals that are ready to understand just what kinds of knock-on effects there are from the decisions we make about our transportation and our infrastructure. Who is this not for? Well, it's not for someone that wants to read less than 1,200 pages. It's not for someone that is not particularly into biographies, especially a biography of an individual that they've never heard of, because chances are you may not have heard of Robert Moses if you are not from New York or you don't have some other reason to be familiar with his legacy. But if you can get over the fact that it is over 1,200 pages, if you can get over the fact that it is a takedown of Robert Moses, if you can get over all that, you can really enjoy this book, I think. I found it an absolutely fascinating read, and I do strongly recommend it. And like I said, I also recommend the companion episodes of the podcast 99% Invisible if you want a little more detail and, of course, some great summaries of what you're going to find in this book. Of course, I'd love to know your thoughts on this book, whether you were also drawn to this book because of 99PI, or if you are just a fan of massive biographies and happen to stumble upon this, or just whatever thoughts you have about this book in general. Please let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications, and until next time, keep those pages turning.